The boy on the pavement was 7 years old, and his name was Leo. He stood directly in the path of the royal guard, clutching his mother's hand and staring up at the enormous black bearskin cap that seemed to touch the gray London sky. It was December, and the wind cut across the forecourt of the Tower of London with a sharpness that made tourists huddle together, their cameras fogging up the moment they raised them. Leo's mother, Priya, was distracted for exactly 3 seconds, just long enough to rummage in her coat pocket for a tissue. And in that sliver of time, Leo pulled his hand free and stepped over the low chain that the public was not supposed to cross. The guard's name was Lance Corporal Thomas Beck, and he had been standing motionless for 47 minutes. He was 22 years old, a farmer's son from Cumbria, and this was his first winter ceremonial posting. Under the weight of the bearskin, sweat trickled down his temples in icy rivulets. His SA-80 rifle, fitted with a polished bayonet, rested at a precise angle against his shoulder. His orders were simple. Stand guard. Do not move. Do not speak unless threatened. Do not break formation for any reason. The Ministry of Defense manual was explicit about crowd interaction. He was not a tourist attraction, he was a deterrent. Leo did not understand deterrence. He saw a man dressed like a soldier in a storybook, and he wanted a closer look. The chain was low, the distance was short, and nobody shouted stop. Priya looked up from her bag just in time to see her son duck under the barrier and take 3 quick steps toward the guard. A woman nearby gasped. A man lowered his video camera, and the crowd went very quiet, the way crowds do when they sense something breaking that cannot be immediately fixed. Thomas saw the boy from the corner of his eye. He was trained to track movement without turning his head, to assess threat levels through peripheral vision. A child, small, dark hair, red coat, no visible weapons. The protocol for public intrusion was drilled into every guardsman from their first week at the infantry training center in Catterick. Shout, stamp, threaten, detain. But the manual did not account for the moment between the shout and the action. When a child looks up at you with nothing but curiosity in his eyes and no comprehension of the uniform, the rifle, the centuries of tradition that said this man was not permitted to smile, nod, or step aside. Thomas did not move. His jaw tightened. His knuckles whitened around the rifle grip. Leo stopped 2 feet from the bayonet tip. He tilted his head back, craning his neck to see the brim of the bearskin. He did not speak. He simply looked, the way children look at things they have never seen before and may never see again. Priya found her voice and screamed her son's name. The sound echoed off the ancient stone walls, and Leo turned his head toward his mother, confused. He had not done anything wrong. He only wanted to see. Thomas Beck had a choice. It would take less than 2 seconds to lower the bayonet to the level of the boy's chest, to shout the prescribed warning, to end the incident exactly as he had been trained. His corporal was watching from the guardhouse. His regiment had a reputation to uphold. The Coldstream Guards did not waver. They did not hesitate. And they had stood guard over kings and queens for 372 years, through wars and blitzes and the changing of empires. One small boy in a red coat was not an excuse to break rank. But Thomas also remembered being 7 years old, standing in a muddy Cumbrian field, watching his father shear sheep in the rain. He remembered looking up at adults who seemed as tall as towers, who never explained why things were the way they were, who expected him to understand the rules without ever writing them down. He remembered the loneliness of being small in a world designed for people twice his size. He did not lower the bayonet. He did not shout. He held his position, eyes forward, breathing steady, and waited. The moment stretched. A tourist from Ohio captured it on her iPhone. The guard statue still, the boy motionless. The bayonet suspended in the gray air like a frozen raindrop. Then Leo's mother lunged forward, scooped her son into her arms, and retreated behind the chain. Someone in the crowd started clapping. Thomas did not acknowledge it. His shift had another hour and 13 minutes to go. But something had shifted inside him. A hairline crack in the armor of his discipline, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who has just discovered the weight of his own humanity, that he would never be the same soldier again. The incident at the Tower of London did not appear in any official log. There was no breach of security, no physical contact, no arrest. The Metropolitan Police were not called. Lance Corporal Thomas Beck completed his shift, returned to the guardroom, and removed his bearskin in silence. The hat weighed nearly 3 pounds, and after 2 hours on post, the pressure always left a deep red crease across his forehead. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and hung the bearskin on its designated peg, aligning it precisely with the others. His corporal, a grizzled veteran named Derek Finlay, who had served in both Iraq and Afghanistan, waited until the younger man had unlaced his boots before speaking. Finlay had watched the entire incident through the guardhouse window. He had seen the boy step forward, seen Beck's failure to follow protocol, seen the tourist videos that would undoubtedly surface on social media within the hour. He had 31 years of service behind him, and he knew that the Army did not forgive deviations from doctrine, no matter how human the motive. "Hey, you want to tell me what happened out there?" Finlay's voice was flat, stripped of judgment. Thomas kept his eyes on his boots. "The child crossed the barrier. He approached my post. I assessed him as non-threatening. He was removed by his guardian. No force was required." Finlay let the silence hang. "You didn't shout." "No, Corporal." "You didn't stamp." "No, Corporal." "You didn't raise your weapon." Thomas finally looked up. His face was pale, but his gaze was steady. "The weapon remained at the standard carry position throughout the incident. I did not deviate from post. I did not engage the civilian. The civilian disengaged voluntarily." Finlay studied him for a long moment. He had seen soldiers freeze before, in combat zones and on ceremonial duty, and their training colliding with something unexpected and their instincts failing to fire. But this was not freezing. This was a deliberate, conscious choice. The boy had been close enough to touch the bayonet. Beck had not flinched. He had not even blinked. "The manual exists for a reason," Finlay said quietly. "It's not a suggestion. It's a response. When you hesitate, you give the threat time to escalate. You endanger yourself, the public, and the monarch. There is no room for interpretation." "Yes, Corporal." The boy was 7 years old. Thomas did not respond. Finlay sighed, the weariness of 3 decades settling into his shoulders. He remembered his own first posting, guarding the forecourt of Buckingham Palace in the summer of 1993, in a heat wave that melted the asphalt and a constant stream of tourists who treated him like a waxwork. He remembered the American woman who had pinched his cheek to see if he was real. He remembered not moving, not speaking, not acknowledging her existence. He had been praised for his composure. He had been promoted 6 months later. The Army did not want soldiers who thought. It wanted soldiers who obeyed. "I'm not writing you up," Finlay said. "But if this goes higher, I won't lie for you." "Understood." "And Beck?" "The public doesn't forget. They'll put your face on the internet. They'll call you a hero or a monster, depending on the angle of the video. You need to decide right now which one you are, because the Army will make its own determination regardless." Thomas nodded slowly. He had already seen the tourists filming, and he knew his face would be circulating within hours, attached to headlines he could not control. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, It settled into his chest like a stone dropped in still water, the ripples spreading outward, unstoppable. That night, alone in his barracks room, he sat on the edge of his cot and stared at the wall. His mother had called earlier, having seen a blurry screenshot on the evening news. She asked if he was in trouble. He told her no. She asked if he was okay. He said yes. Both statements were lies, and they both knew it. But the distance between Cumbria and London was too vast to bridge with truth. He thought about his father, who had died 3 years ago of a heart attack in the sheep field, face down in the mud. His father had never understood why Thomas joined the army. There was no military tradition in the family. The Becks had been farmers for 6 generations, working the same plot of land since 1842. Thomas was the first to leave. He told himself he left because he wanted adventure, because he wanted to see the world, because the farm was dying and there was nothing left for him there. But the real reason was simpler. He wanted to be part of something larger than himself. He wanted to wear a uniform that meant something. He wanted to stand guard over history. Now he had stood guard over a 7-year-old boy in a red coat, and he had failed to follow the script. He had seen his own reflection in the boy's curious eyes, and for one suspended moment, he had recognized himself. The same uncertainty, the same hunger for understanding, and the same desperate hope that the world would make sense if he only looked hard enough. He did not sleep that night. He lay awake, watching the ceiling, replaying the incident from every angle, searching for the moment when he could have done something differently. But the truth was that he would make the same choice again. The boy was 7. The bayonet was steel. Some lines once crossed could never be uncrossed. In the morning, he reported for duty as usual. The corporal did not mention the incident. The other guardsmen did not meet his eyes. The tourists outside the Tower of London were already gathering, cameras raised, waiting for the man from the viral video to emerge. Thomas took his post, adjusted the weight of the bare skin, and stared straight ahead. He did not know it yet, but his war had only just begun. 3 weeks later, Lance Corporal Thomas Beck received a summons to Wellington Barracks. The message was delivered by a junior officer who refused to make eye contact, simply handed over a sealed envelope, and retreated before Thomas could ask any questions. Inside was a single sheet of paper, crisp and official, instructing him to present himself at 0900 hours to meet with Major Alistair Graves of the Regimental Standards and Conduct Committee. Thomas had never heard of the Standards and Conduct Committee. He had been in the regiment for 4 years, had served in Cyprus and Northern Ireland, had received commendations for marksmanship and discipline. He had never once been formally reprimanded. The envelope felt heavier than it should. He spent the night before the meeting writing a letter to his mother. He did not know what he expected to happen: dishonorable discharge, demotion, reassignment to a desk job in some forgotten depot. But he wanted her to hear it from him first, not from a journalist or a neighbor. He folded the letter, tucked it into his footlocker, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. Major Graves was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the posture of a cathedral spire. His office was sparse: a desk, 2 chairs, a portrait of the Queen, and a single filing cabinet. He did not offer Thomas a seat. He stood behind the desk, hands clasped behind his back, and studied the young guardsman with the detached interest of a biologist examining a specimen. "Lance Corporal Beck," Graves began, his voice clipped and precise, "you have been the subject of considerable discussion within this command. The incident at the Tower of London has generated over 4 million views across various social media platforms. Public opinion is divided. Some view your restraint as compassionate, others view it as a dereliction of duty." Thomas stood at attention, eyes fixed on a point just above Graves' left shoulder. "Yes, sir." The Manual of Drill and Ceremonial Duties is quite explicit on the handling of public intrusions. Guardsmen are instructed to issue a verbal warning, stamp the ground to create a deterrent effect, and if necessary, raise the weapon to a defensive position. Physical contact is authorized only in cases of imminent threat. You performed none of these actions. No, sir. May I ask why? Thomas hesitated. He had rehearsed this answer 100 times, refining it, stripping it of emotion, rendering it as clinical and defensible as a battlefield report. But standing in this cold office, under the unblinking gaze of a man who had clearly already made up his mind, the rehearsed words evaporated. Sir, he said slowly, the child was 7 years old. He was not a threat. He was not accompanied by any adult who posed a risk. He simply wanted to see the uniform. I assessed the situation and determined that following the manual would have caused unnecessary distress to a minor. I made a judgment call. Graves removed his spectacles and polished them with a small cloth. The gesture was unhurried, almost meditative. Judgment calls are for officers, Lance Corporal. Your role is to execute orders, not interpret them. The manual exists precisely because individual judgment is unreliable, inconsistent, and subjective. If every guardsman decided for himself when to apply protocol, the entire ceremonial structure would collapse. Yes, sir. And yet. Graves replaced his spectacles and folded his hands on the desk. And yet, the Queen herself has been informed of this incident. Her private secretary conveyed a message to the regimental lieutenant colonel this morning. Her Majesty expressed the view that the guardsman in question demonstrated commendable restraint, and that the regiment should be proud of its soldiers' professionalism. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Sir, you are not being disciplined, Lance Corporal. You are being reassigned. Effective immediately, you will transfer to Buckingham Palace Guard, number 4, post, for the remainder of your ceremonial rotation. The colonel considers this an opportunity for you to demonstrate that your judgment can be exercised within the boundaries of protocol, not outside them. It was not a promotion. It was not a commendation. It was a test, and they both knew it. Buckingham Palace was the highest profile posting in the regiment. Every movement scrutinized, every hesitation analyzed. One mistake, one deviation, one moment of perceived weakness, and the committee would reconvene with far less leniency. Do you understand your orders, Lance Corporal? Yes, sir. Perfectly. Graves nodded once, a crisp dismissal. Thomas turned to leave, his hand already on the door handle, when the major spoke again. Beck, the Queen is 89 years old. She has seen guardsmen faint from heat stroke, collapse from exhaustion, and once, in 1972, accidentally discharge a weapon during a changing ceremony. She has seen every possible human failure that ceremonial duty can produce. She does not grant her approval lightly. Whatever you did that afternoon, you earned something very few soldiers ever receive. Do not waste it. Thomas did not respond. He walked out of the office, through the corridor, into the gray December morning. The wind had shifted, carrying the scent of rain. He stood on the pavement outside Wellington Barracks and watched the tourists streaming toward the palace, their cameras glinting like scattered coins. Somewhere among them, perhaps, a 7-year-old boy in a red coat was looking at the guards and wondering what lay beneath the bearskin. His first shift at Buckingham Palace was scheduled for the following Monday. He would stand at number 4 post, and the same position where, in 1992, a 17-year-old guardsman had hidden a bottle of water under his hat because he was too afraid to be seen accepting kindness from his monarch. Thomas had read about that incident in the regimental archives. The guardsman's name was Alan Sadler. and he had kept the secret for 30 years, telling no one until the Queen's death finally freed him from the fear of punishment. Thomas understood that fear now. He understood the weight of the uniform, the centuries of expectation, the invisible walls that separated the guards from the people they protected. But he also understood, with a clarity that felt like a physical wound, that the walls were built by men, and men could choose to lower them. He walked back to his barracks and retrieved the unsent letter from his footlocker. And he tore it into small pieces, let them fall into the wastebasket, and began to write a new one. This time, he told his mother the truth, that he was afraid, that he was uncertain, that he did not know if he had done the right thing or merely the easy thing. But he also told her that for the first time since his father died, he felt like he belonged somewhere. Not to the army, not to the regiment, but to the long, unbroken line of ordinary men who stood guard over something they could never fully understand, simply because it was their duty to stand. The morning of his first shift at Buckingham Palace, Thomas woke at 4:30. He performed his ablutions in silence, dressed with mechanical precision, and stood before the full-length mirror in the corner of his room. The uniform was immaculate: scarlet tunic, the navy trousers with the regulation red stripe, white gloves, polished boots. He settled the bearskin onto his head, adjusting it until the brim sat exactly 1 inch above his eyebrows. The face that stared back at him was not the face of the man who had hesitated at the Tower of London. That man had been uncertain, divided, haunted by the ghost of a 7-year-old boy. This man was a guardsman of the Coldstream Regiment, tasked with protecting the oldest monarchy in Europe. The walk from the barracks to the palace was short, no more than 10 minutes, but Thomas took it slowly. The streets were quiet at this hour, empty of tourists, the only sound the distant rumble of early morning traffic. He passed the Victoria Memorial, its white marble still shadowed in the pre-dawn gray, and approached the north center gate of Buckingham Palace. Number. Her forepost was located just inside the forecourt, positioned to monitor visitors approaching from the mall. It was not the most visible post. That honor belonged to the guards directly outside the front gate. But it was strategically crucial, the first line of defense, against anyone attempting to enter the palace grounds without authorization. Thomas had studied the post's history, its famous incidents and near misses. He knew that in 1982, Michael Fagan had scaled the palace fence less than 50 yards from this spot, evading detection long enough to reach the Queen's bedroom. He knew that in 2014, a guardsman named William Wright had left this post to confront a Nigerian immigrant who was shouting threats at police, leveling his bayonet at the man's throat in a moment captured by a dozen tourist cameras. And that guardsman had been praised for his swift action, his willingness to deviate from protocol in the face of genuine threat. He had also been quietly counseled for leaving his post without authorization. Thomas took his position, grounded his boots, and fixed his gaze on the horizon. The first tourists would arrive within the hour, clutching their selfie sticks and guidebooks, eager to capture the iconic red uniforms against the iconic palace facade. They would not know that the men inside those uniforms were farmers' sons and city kids. Veterans of desert wars and peacetime patrols, ordinary soldiers performing an extraordinary act of endurance. They would not know that the bearskins weighed 3 pounds, that the boots were unlined and offered no insulation against the cold, that the guards were forbidden to eat, drink, or use the lavatory during their 2-hour shifts. They would see symbols, not men. By mid-morning, the forecourt was crowded. Thomas counted at least 200 visitors pressed against the railings, phones raised, children hoisted onto shoulders. He did not move. He did not blink. He became the statue they expected, the living monument. the guardian of thresholds they would never cross. And then he saw her. She was perhaps 60 years old, silver-haired, wearing a sensible wool coat and carrying a worn leather handbag. She did not have a camera or a phone. She did not jostle for position or wave at the guards. She stood at the edge of the crowd, slightly apart, her hands clasped in front of her. Her gaze was fixed on Thomas with an intensity that made his skin prickle beneath the tunic. He knew her. He did not know her name. Had never met her in his life, but he knew her. She was the mother of the 7-year-old boy in the red coat. 3 weeks had passed, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The same dark eyes, the same quiet stillness, the same way of looking at the world as though it were a book she was trying to read. She did not approach the barrier. She did not speak. She simply stood, watching him, for a very long time. Thomas did not acknowledge her presence. His training demanded it, and his pride demanded it, and his fear of what might happen if he broke formation again demanded it. But beneath the bearskin, beneath the frozen mask of his face, something was fracturing. He thought about his father, dying alone in a muddy field. He thought about the Queen, tasting soldiers' lunches at Balmoral to ensure they were properly fed. And he thought about Alan Sadler, the 17-year-old guardsman who had balanced a bottle of water on his head for 2 hours rather than risk being caught accepting a gift. He thought about the millions of tourists who had passed through this forecourt, who had photographed these guards, who had returned home with thousands of images of men they would never know and never understand. And he thought about the boy who had stepped forward, not out of malice or defiance, but out of simple, uncomplicated curiosity. The boy who had looked at a symbol and seen a man. The woman in the wool coat turned away. She walked slowly, without looking back, disappearing into the crowd streaming toward the mall. Thomas watched her go, his eyes tracking her silver hair until it vanished among the sea of heads and shoulders. He did not move, and he did not blink. He stood guard over the palace of his monarch, and he tried very hard not to think about the things he had lost and the things he had found, and the long gray distance between who he was and who he was supposed to be. His shift ended at 1300. He returned to the guard room, removed his bearskin, and sat alone in the silence. The other guardsmen gave him space. Word had spread about his meeting with Major Graves, his transfer to the palace, the Queen's inexplicable intervention. They did not know what to make of him, this soldier who had refused to shout at a child and somehow been rewarded for his disobedience. Thomas did not try to explain. He did not know how. The language of duty was the only language he had ever been taught, and it had no words for mercy, no vocabulary for compassion. And he sat in the gray afternoon light, turning his bearskin over in his hands, and waited for the next shift to begin. He did not know that across the city, in a small flat in South London, the silver-haired woman was telling her grandson about the soldier who had not moved. The soldier who had looked at a little boy with nothing but patience in his eyes. She did not know the soldier's name or his regiment or the weight of the bearskin on his head, but she knew, with the certainty of a grandmother who had spent 60 years learning to read the hearts of men, that he was a good man. And she prayed, as she tucked her grandson into bed that night, that the world would be kind to him. The boy's name was Leo. He was 7 years old, and he still did not understand why the soldier had not smiled. But he remembered the way the light had glinted off the bayonet, the stillness of the scarlet tunic, the silence that had fallen over the crowd. He remembered feeling for one suspended moment as though he were the only person in the world that mattered. He did not have words for that feeling yet, but he would carry it with him for the rest of his life. A small, warm stone in the pocket of his memory. And on the other side of the city, Lance Corporal Thomas Beck, picked up his rifle, settled his bearskin onto his head, and walked back to his post. The tourists were still there, cameras raised, children on shoulders. The gray sky was still pressing down on the golden gates. The centuries of tradition were still wrapped around his shoulders like chainmail. But the woman had come. She had looked at him and seen not a symbol, but a man. Oh, and that, Thomas thought, was enough. That was everything. He stood guard. The afternoon passed. The tourists came and went. And somewhere in the vast, indifferent city, a boy in a red coat dreamed of soldiers who did not move, and wondered if they ever dreamed of him.